The Capital Connection is a production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. David Gustina is the producer of The Capital Connection. Support comes from United University Professions, representing 37,000 academic and professional employees at SUNY campuses and teaching hospitals across New York State. Frederick E. Cole, President, uupinfo.org.
It's the Capital Connection. Hi, I'm Alan Chartock. Joining us this week is Yancey Roy, the Albany Bureau Chief for Newsday. Yancey is sort of a major dean of the press corps. Welcome, Yancey.
Good to be here, Alan.
You work for Newsday, so we'll start out with this one. Elections. From Long Island to Buffalo, what are the major highlights, if any, in New York State?
Well, you've got several highlights, and you've got several little stories on Long Island. There were three big races, a county executive in Nassau and two district attorney races. And it looks as though the Republicans are going to win all of those. And not only that, they're going to gain seats in the Nassau County legislature. It was a big year for Republicans. I think issues were a little bit different in each race. For example, the district attorney's race, the Republicans made a lot of hay about the recently enacted changes to bail laws, specifically not requiring cash bail on most misdemeanors. And they just really dogged the Democratic candidates for district attorney on that over and over and over again. And no matter how much you explain your position on it, in fact, the Suffolk County incumbent DA had opposed it altogether. It was just sort of the thing that was the albatross around the neck of the district attorney candidates on Long Island and led to their defeat. In the county executive, it was a little bit of a different wrinkle. There's a controversial property reassessment overhaul that happened, which by and large was often hailed as fair and as putting the assessments sort of in a fair system. But when you're the county executive and you prevail over some changes like that are going to upset a lot of people, combined with the Republican momentum in other races, it looks as though Laura Curran, who had been a rising star in Democratic circles, is probably headed for defeat. They've still got some absentees to count, but it doesn't look like she'll be able to overcome her deficit, and she'll probably lose to Bruce Blakeman. But I tell you what, Alan, you look on the other side of the Long Island Sound, and George Latimer, a Democrat, county executive, cruised to re-election. So I don't know that you can say, it's certainly a good year for Republicans, but I don't know that you would say they won everywhere. You mentioned Buffalo. Look at what happened there. Now, a Democrat won, Byron Brown. He's declared victory. It's not official yet because he had to run a write-in campaign against India Walton, the self-proclaimed Democratic socialist.
How did she win a primary?
There's a lot of good analysis in the BuffaloNews.com. I would certainly recommend people check out their coverage. But I think what's coming through is that back during the primary, Byron Brown, the incumbent, who's been there, I want to say 16 years, basically was on cruise control and didn't really campaign that hard and underestimated his opponent, who had really generated some excitement with the left of the party out there in Buffalo. And she rolled to a surprising win. And it's somewhat akin to what happened with Alexandria or Cortez against Joe Crowley in the congressional seat in Queens, which, was a shocker a few years ago, where a longtime incumbent just kind of more or less sleepwalked through the primary. But Byron Brown rallied, ran this big write-in campaign. Because it's a write-in, none of the tallies are official yet, but he's declaring victory, and the Buffalo News says that certainly there are far, far more write-in ballots that were received than even votes for India Walton. So it appears that Byron Brown might have rallied to save his seat, which some people are saying shows that the Democratic Socialist message only went so far. It worked fine in a primary, but not maybe in a general election.
It's all about turnout, isn't it? I mean, if it's a fatigued election and all of a sudden the Democratic Socialists show up and nobody else does, they're going to win.
Right. And what happened with Byron Brown in Buffalo is within days after the shocking primary results, it was clear that they more or less just didn't take the opposition seriously enough and didn't campaign hard enough. They were sort of on cruise control.
Right. Well, there's so much to talk about. What else do you see going on in New York that makes us sit up and take notice? What about the city of New York?
Well, that came out as expected. Eric Adams, who won the Democratic nomination in the primary earlier this year, cruising to a win over Curtis Sliwa. That was fully expected. There's going to be a new DA as well, Alvin Bragg, holding the office, a Democrat holding the office in New York City. On a smaller scale, the city of Albany right here in the Capital District is kind of the same dynamics in that the enrollment in the city is so overwhelmingly Democratic that most of the competition occurs in the primaries. And whether you're a Republican or an independent, as we saw a couple of candidates in Albany trying to take on Mayor Kathy Sheehan, you're just so overwhelmingly outnumbered that it's hard for anyone but a Democrat to win a general election in Albany or New York City. It does happen occasionally, at least in New York, under special circumstances, but by and large, it's going to go to the Democrats. One other race we should mention for sure is Syracuse. Ben Walsh was an independent elected 4 years ago, and it looks as though he has won re-election, even while facing a Democrat and a Republican. He's been a moderate Republican. He was the son of a congressman. And what's also notable is that Syracuse is the only place, where a Democrat is not the only major New York city, I should say that, major New York city in New York State, let me straighten that out. Major city in New York State where a Democrat is not the mayor.
How come?
I think that when Walsh won 4 years ago, there was a combination of his father was a congressman, so there was a well-known family name. He was a moderate who appealed to a lot of people on either side of the aisle. And I think that also was repeated. It sounds like, according to the Syracuse newspaper coverage, that was repeated as well.
Mm-hmm. So, Yancey Roy, how is this upstate, downstate competition going? There used to be a sense, okay, the Republicans could win the Senate, they could reapportion in their own favor, but now it's a Democratic Senate by a lot, a Democratic Assembly, Democratic governor. Do the Republicans have any chance of staying alive?
Well, I think they are going to take heart in, especially their wins on Long Island. They've won in both counties, Nassau and Suffolk. One of the people they defeated was Todd Kaminsky. Todd Kaminsky is a state senator who was running for Nassau district attorney. He's lost that race. He will remain a state senator, but he'll be up for re-election next year, as will the rest of the Long Island delegation, of which there are 9 senators and I wanted to say 22 or 23. I'm trying to remember assembly people, but I think that in a lot of areas where it's sort of a swing, sort of purple area, if you will, the Republicans are going to take heart in saying we can repeat this again in 2022. Now, I mean, that remains to be seen. Like I said, there were a lot of local issues related to the Republican victories on Long Island this year. Will they still be in play on state legislative elections next year? I don't know. We'll have to see. But certainly they're going to use stuff like bail laws to try to knock out some Democratic legislators on the island.
Well, what were the choices on the bail laws? I mean, you obviously have people who cannot afford bail and can't pay hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they are consigned to staying in jail because they can't do that. What's the discussion?
Well, I mean, sometimes it's not even pay a few $100s or maybe $1,000.
Yeah.
And that's true. I think that what happened was that the Republicans were able to use concern or fear about the issue, and in some cases, some incidents where there were repeat offenders, and use that to generate a campaign around and sort of point out, for example, as we're talking about Todd Kaminsky, he did vote for the change in the bail laws. Now, he was in an interesting position because he was among the members of the Long Island delegation. We're going back into how this was all done. The bail laws were done. The Long Island delegation was the part of the Democratic Party that was fighting to soften the original proposals that a number of Democrats favored. It was some of the proposals would have been even more far-reaching on bail, and they were modified thanks to input from the Long Island Democrats. Now, however, in the end, they voted for the change anyway. And when you get out there on the campaign or in a debate and your opponent's saying you voted for the bail laws and you try to explain, well, yes, but I did, but I modified it and I fought to change it, all of a sudden I think it becomes just a little more complicated to come across to voters and explain your position. And I think that's part of what probably hurt the district attorney candidates on the island.
You know, Yancey Roy, when I was a younger man, let's put it that way, and coming up, the Republicans ruled Long Island. What happened?
A lot of demographic changes. There's more Democrats in Nassau County than Republicans now. And Suffolk remains a little bit stronger Republican area. As you might know, they were stronger for Donald Trump in 16 and in 20. But it's a different sort of electorate there. I mean, forever it was the Long Island Nine. That was the moniker applied to the 9 Republican senators from Long Island, who were such a significant bloc that almost anything that went through the state Senate went through them. Well, now it's 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans and of the Long Island Senate delegation. And, you know, some of those Democrats are pretty well ensconced now. And, you know, Republicans might have a fighting chance against a couple of them next year. But, you know, the idea of it going all back to a Republican delegation, I don't know that that's going to happen.
So, Yancey Roy, this is the question. We now have a Democratic governor, Democratic legislature, and we do have reapportionment coming up. So when you take a look at something like Long Island, which you're such an expert on, as well as the state, will this reapportionment be used to help the Democrats? And in a place like Long Island,
yes.
Will it make a difference?
I think the answer to the first is yes. I mean, the Democrats have control of the process. They have the Senate and the Assembly. The constitutional amendment proposal, by the way, about redistricting, it looks like that's gone down on election night. And the significance of that is it's one step closer to basically the state legislature taking control, as it always has, of the redistricting process. And the Senate Democrats and Assembly Democrats will most likely draw the lines when this happens at the early part of next year. And I think, yes, for sure they will use it to Democratic advantage. I don't know exactly how they will draw the lines. And when you're talking about congressional delegation, they'll probably have more impact upstate in how they draw the lines than on Long Island. But, you know, look, their rationale is going to be, you know, in red states like Texas and North Carolina, the Republicans are drawing lines to help their party and hurt the Democrats. So in the context of balance of power for Congress, yeah, you bet in New York the Democrats are going to try to help Democratic candidates.
Okay, so in New York City, Democrat Eric Adams has defeated Republican Curtis Sliwa. Now, I always thought that was a joke race. You know, Sliwa with his beret and walking around the subways was not, to me, a serious candidate. And it turned out that while I'm not always right about things, often not right, I was right about that one.
You know, the Republicans have had a string of victories in that race in recent times, obviously Rudy Giuliani and Michael Bloomberg, but a couple of times those were when there were special circumstances. Take it, for example, especially Bloomberg. 9/11 had happened. He was a billionaire who could spend as much money as he wanted. The Democrats were kind of divided. Since then, since Bloomberg, the Republican candidates who have come after him are not known. They don't have $1 billion. And there was no special circumstance, some political disaster that hurt Democrats. So absent some of those specific kind of conditions, it's hard to see a Republican having a pathway to victory. And Eric Adams won a crowded primary field. He was certainly not the most lefty of the candidates. In fact, he was more the moderate wing. And I think that to kind of jump off into another territory here, You're going to have folks now wondering how does this maybe affect the gubernatorial race that's going to be coming up next year. In fact, we've already got candidates out there. Kathy Hochul, the sitting governor, Letitia James, the attorney general, has declared her candidacy. Does this mean anything for that race? I don't know. We'll see. Kathy Hochul certainly would be the more moderate of those two, but we don't know who else might jump in the race. Just a couple of days ago, Bill de Blasio filed to the paperwork to form a campaign committee if he indeed wants to run for governor. Now, he hasn't officially declared anything yet, but he's formed a committee. Jumaane Williams, the New York City public advocate, has also formed a committee. You've got some folks on Long Island who might be interested in running. Tom Suozzi, the congressman, Steve Bellone, the Suffolk County executive. Certainly they would be positioning themselves as more in the moderate wing of the Democratic Party. And folks who are doing that might say, look at what happened in the New York City race. Look at what happened in the Buffalo mayoral race. This shows that it's actually the moderate Democrats are the ones that we should support. And I'm going to throw this out at you as well. Alan, we're speaking here on the day after the election, and this weekend is the annual gathering of Somos El Futuro, the gathering of Hispanic leaders in New York politics in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Kathy Hochul is supposed to go down there. Tish James is supposed to go down there. I got to imagine, if you're following politics, follow what maybe happens or what stories generate out of there and how folks are there are also receiving some of the results that we saw.
The name you didn't mention in the New York primary, coming gubernatorial primary, was Andrew Cuomo. There was some speculation, mainly by me, that he might jump.
Well, he could. There's, the other folks have thrown out the idea that he'd run for attorney general. Just a week ago, as folks probably know, the Albany County Sheriff filed a criminal complaint against the governor in regards to at least one of the sexual harassment allegations against him. And his attorney has been vocal in trying to fight back against that. And I think, there's some speculation about what he might do. He's got $18 million in his campaign account. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, certainly the immediate priority for him and his supporters would be what happens next with a couple of things. One is the criminal complaint. Two is the Assembly Impeachment Committee is still working on a report about their investigation, which they haven't made public yet. I got to imagine that now that we're past Election Day, any other sort of hurdles or calendar considerations are now gone, and you would think they would finish up on that report. And then there's also the potential possibility of some of the women who made allegations filing any kind of civil suits against the former governor. So, those things are out there as possibilities, and I think some of those, we'll have to see how any of that plays out before we can get to the idea of whether he'd run for something again.
I've always had the feeling that if he does run, I think he's going to do it at the last minute, and that would stop the Cuomo haters from doing their thing. I found it very suspicious that this thing came up right now, this charge, and that the prosecutor in that case had not talked to the district attorney in Albany County where it's going on. I think there's a lot that's been made of that. Cuomo is not at his highest favorability rating, that's for sure, but there is a question of fair play here.
Well, the sheriff was asked a question about that at his press conference, and he did make a point. There's two things to point out here. One thing he said is this is a misdemeanor complaint, and if we had to go through the district attorney every time we file a misdemeanor complaint, you'd never have any cases going forward. I think that's a fair point, but also on the other side of that is this is no ordinary misdemeanor case, right? This isn't a non-public person who's charged with something. And so the follow-up with that would be, well, wouldn't there be sort of a different consideration considering the high-profile nature of this case? That said, where we are now is, I think it's going to, at some point, maybe not just yet, but at some point it's going to be in the hands of the Albany County District Attorney, David Soares, to decide what to do with the case. And that's sort of the next big, and he would have certainly the authority to prosecute fully. He could decide not to, or anything in between, negotiate. I don't know.
I remember very well when a group of college professors came up furious at Cuomo for something or other, and they stood on the park right outside the Capitol, and Cuomo basically wanted them arrested. And Soares said, I'm not going to prosecute that case. So he certainly is capable of not prosecuting what he thinks may smell a little.
You're referring to the Occupy New York sort of protests that were at the Capitol, and Cuomo was getting a lot of heat for that. This was in his first term, and he wanted Albany PD to just roust everyone out of there and the DA to prosecute him, and the DA said he wouldn't. And so the police said, we're not going to go to all of this hassle of getting engaged in some blowback if the DA is not even going to prosecute. So that's an example of David Soares, who's still the prosecutor, certainly back an example in history of him not necessarily doing, whatever some higher office holder or the Governor Cuomo himself would want him to do.
Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the new district attorney in New York County, Mr. Bragg. The question for you is, will that make a difference in the way in which that office goes after Trump? I'll be honest with you, Yancey. I've been very disturbed with the Manhattan DA. Not that I count, but he's been delivered a lot of information, a lot of tax information, and nothing has happened. Is there any sense that the change in district attorneys for New York might spell more danger for Trump himself?
Well, I think Cyrus Vance Jr., the incumbent who didn't seek re-election, he was still pushing the case about the tax fraud and had been going and had recently obtained Trump's tax filing records for several years. So, it hadn't been moving as quickly as some people want, but the case was still moving on. That said, Alvin Bragg, who, by the way, used to work in the state attorney general's office, and one of his portfolios in that office, people may or may not know this, was helping write the laws that led to New York when there's an incident where a police officer kills a civilian, it is now investigated by the attorney general's office rather than a local district attorney. Alvin Bragg had a big hand in that. He has promised to be very aggressive about Trump, and maybe, the implication of that is maybe move faster than Cyrus Vance had. And certainly as he takes office, that's going to be maybe even the most high-profile case that he inherits from Vance, which is about whether Trump ran a years-long tax scheme to help him evade taxes. And the other thing about it beyond Trump is going to be how does he run, criminal prosecutions. He is now one of what folks would consider the progressive prosecutor movement. And there's been some high-profile people in other cities. Larry Krasner in Philadelphia. PBS did a long series special on him, which a lot of folks saw. Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, where they are trying to implement new ways of running a local DA's office, where they're saying, our policy is not going to be round everybody up and put them in jail and prosecute every low-level offense aggressively. They're trying to take more diversionary steps. And how they've succeeded depends a little bit on how you view the issues in those cities. But certainly Bragg is now going to be one of a handful. There's others as well that besides Krasner. But there's now a handful of big city prosecutors who are promising to be more progressive, especially on criminal prosecutions, ordinary everyday prosecutions, not just the sort of things that involve a former president. And so I think in some ways that's going to be fascinating to watch how Alvin Bragg directs, or rather changes the direction of that office.
Let me bring up the Supreme Court with you. The Supreme Court began hearing arguments this week in a gun rights case that could lead to more guns on the streets of New York and Los Angeles. How's that going to play out politically in New York?
Well, I tell you, if you're talking about a case that involves some New York state laws and right. gun rights and concealed carry and such, if you were looking at this from a Democratic strategist point of view, you might say Democrats certainly approve and back strong gun laws in New York State. But if the Supreme Court acts to overturn the state law, well, from sort of a cold-hearted strategy standpoint, you've now got an issue handed to you for next year's elections. because New York is very supportive overall. New Yorkers are supportive overall of strong gun laws. The Democrats could have an issue that they can now use in the 22 elections against Republicans. Hey, you've got to back us because all of these laws that you support that we passed in the past are now under attack, and so we have to go to work and pass new laws to protect people from gun violence.
Do you remember Zephyr Teachout?
Sure, who doesn't?
Exactly. Now, Zephyr Teachout, says she wants to run for Attorney General. She's well known, as you said, who doesn't? Does that give her an easy ride up?
Oh, no, not easy by any means. Doesn't mean she can't win, but not easy. I mean, there's going to be a number of folks who are interested in this race. As Tish James, the sitting Attorney General, has now declared she's running for governor, I think we're going to have a slew of candidates who are going to be interested in Attorney General. Probably not announcing this week, but maybe by Thanksgiving or by December 1st. I mean, some of the folks who, besides Zephyr, who are interested include State Senator Michael Gianaris from Queens, Eric Gonzalez, District Attorney in New York City, Shelley Mayer, a state senator, Democrat from Westchester County. That name has been floated as well. There might be other candidates as well who emerge. But, I mean, look, a vacancy in a statewide office doesn't occur very often. So I got to imagine there's going to be a number of folks who are interested in running for that office, just as there was in 2010 and in 2006.
It'll be quite a primary, won't it? Yancey Roy, we love having you on our show on the Capital Connection because you know so much when the rest of us know so little. And so thank you so much for being with us, and we hope to have you on real soon again.
Great to be with you, Alan.